Left bleeding in the dirt while a cowardly town watched, Clara's fate seemed sealed, until a haunted stranger with a loaded Colt decided he'd seen enough. But can two fractured souls survive when a dead husband's darkest secrets ignite a frontier war? Today's journey is a powerful reminder that our deepest scars don't define our worth. They simply prove we were strong enough to survive and rise again. Welcome to our channel, your home for the raw beauty of the Wild West. If you love stories of grit and redemption, please hit that like button, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to ride along with us for more. Now, let's step into the dust of Red Creek.
Clara tasted copper and dry dirt, but the most deafening sound in Red Creek wasn't the sickening thud of a boot against her ribs. It was the absolute cowardly silence of the crowd. She lay on her side in the center of her own freight yard, her cheek pressed against the splintered, sun-baked planks of the loading dock. A heavy drop of blood rolled from her split lip, cutting a clean path through the grime on her chin. Above her stood Miller, a mountain of a man with tobacco-stained teeth and eyes like a dead fish. He was one of Harlan Decker's prime enforcers, a man who got paid to break things that wouldn't bend. Today, that thing was Clara Vance. "I'll ask you one last time, widow," Miller growled, his voice a low rasp that barely carried over the hot afternoon wind. He dug the steel toe of his boot into her stomach, pressing just enough to make her gasp. "Where is the ledger?" Clara coughed, her lungs burning, fighting for a breath that felt like inhaling shattered glass. She forced her eyes open, blinking past the swelling in her left brow. Through the haze of pain, she looked past Miller's massive frame, across the dusty expanse of Main Street. There, standing on the shaded balcony of the Silver Spur Saloon, was Harlan Decker. He wore a pristine three-piece suit that mocked the territorial heat, leaning casually against the railing. He didn't shout, he didn't threaten. He merely took a slow drag from his cigar and gave a lazy, barely perceptible flick of his fingers. "Finish it." Miller saw the signal. He let out a heavy sigh as if beating a woman to death in broad daylight was nothing more than a tedious chore. "Shame," he muttered, drawing his arm back. "You were a pretty thing, Mrs. Vance." Clara braced herself, curling her arms around her chest. She wasn't going to beg. If she was going to die on the dirt of the freight station she and her husband had built from nothing, she would do it with her teeth clenched. She squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the killing blow. It never came. Instead, a sound ripped through the suffocating heat, a sound Clara knew well. The sharp, mechanical snick-clack of a Colt peacemaker's hammer being pulled back. "Step away from her." The voice was low, rough as coarse-grit sandpaper, and carried a deadly kind of calm. Miller froze. He turned his head slowly, his hand instinctively dropping toward the iron holstered at his hip. The ring of cowardly townsfolk, the blacksmith, the baker, the men who bought Clara's goods just yesterday, parted like water. Riding through the gap was a man on a massive, scarred roan gelding. He wore a faded canvas duster coated in trail dust, and a Stetson pulled low, casting his eyes in dark shadow. He hadn't drawn his weapon with a flourish. The long barrel of his Colt .45 was simply already resting across the horn of his saddle, steady as a rock, pointed dead at Miller's chest. Silas Thorne had only come into Red Creek for a sack of flour, a tin of coffee, and some horseshoe nails. He hated this town. He hated the stench of cheap whiskey and cheaper morals. But mostly, he hated the unnatural quiet that had fallen over the main street the moment he rode in. He had seen the circle of people. He had seen the men looking at their boots. And then he had seen her. She was curled in the dirt, her dress torn at the shoulder, her face a canvas of bruises and blood. But it wasn't the beating that made Silas stop. It was her eyes. When she had looked up at the balcony, Silas hadn't seen the broken spirit of a victim. He had seen pure, unadulterated defiance. It was a look he hadn't seen in a long time, a look that belonged to the living. "This ain't your business, Drifter," Miller warned, his fingers twitching near his holster. Two other hired guns stepped out from the shadows of the freight office, their hands hovering over their weapons. "Ride on," The boss is handling local affairs. Silas didn't look at the balcony. He kept his gaze pinned on Miller. I need flour, Silas said, his voice terrifyingly flat. And I don't like the smell of this street. Then hold your breath, Miller sneered. In a flash of practiced violence, Miller drew his gun. He was fast, but he was drawing against a ghost. Before Miller's gun could even clear leather, the street exploded. Bang! Silas didn't shout a warning. He didn't give a heroic speech about justice. He simply squeezed the trigger. Miller shrieked, a high-pitched sound that tore through the valley. His heavy revolver clattered to the wooden boards, followed by a spray of crimson. Silas's bullet had shattered Miller's right hand, turning his knuckles into a mess of splintered bone and torn flesh. Miller fell to his knees, cradling his ruined hand against his chest, screaming obscenities. The two other thugs froze, their guns half drawn. Silas shifted his aim smoothly, the smoking barrel of his Colt now leveled right between the eyes of the nearest man. The message in Silas's icy gray eyes was unmistakable. Pull it, and you die next. Slowly, carefully, the thugs raised their empty hands, stepping back into the shadows. Up on the balcony, Harlan Decker had stopped smoking. He stood perfectly still, his eyes locked on the stranger on the roan horse. Silas ignored him. He holstered his Colt with a fluid motion and swung down from his saddle. His boots hit the dirt with a heavy thud. He walked past the writhing Miller without a spare glance, his spurs jingling softly in the dead silence of the town. He stopped beside Clara. Up close, the damage was worse. Her breathing was shallow, hitched with the sharp pain of cracked ribs. She looked up at him, her chest heaving, her hands trembling as she tried to push herself up. Don't move, Silas commanded softly. He shrugged out of his heavy canvas duster. The coat was warm, smelling of wood smoke, horse leather, and rain. He knelt in the dirt, his movements surprisingly gentle for a man who had just blown another man's hand apart, and wrapped the thick coat around her shoulders, covering her torn bodice and shivering frame. Clara flinched when his large, calloused hands brushed her arms, but she didn't pull away. I've got you, he murmured. Silas slid one arm under her knees and the other behind her back. With a grunt of effort, he lifted her from the blood-stained wood. Clara gasped, a sharp cry escaping her lips as her ribs protested, and her head fell against his shoulder. Carrying her, Silas turned back to his horse. He looked at the crowd of townsfolk, his gaze sweeping over the grocer, the sheriff hiding inside his office, the men who had done nothing. His lip curled in utter disgust. He hoisted Clara into the saddle of his roan, securing her carefully before swinging up behind her. He took the reins in one hand, his other arm wrapping securely around her waist to keep her upright. She was shockingly light, but the iron will radiating from her trembling body was heavier than anything he'd ever carried. Silas finally looked up at the balcony. Decker stared back, the cigar now a cold stub in his hand. No words were exchanged, but the declaration of war was signed in the dust and blood of the street. Silas kicked his spurs into the roan's flanks. The horse snorted and broke into a steady trot, carrying them away from the freight yard, away from the cowardly silence, and toward the jagged mouth of the canyon. Lifting her broken body into the saddle, Silas knew he had just painted a massive bloody target on his own back. He had just declared war on the most powerful man in the territory for a woman he didn't even know. But as the town faded behind them, he felt Clara's head rest against his collarbone. He felt her faint, stubborn heartbeat stuttering against his chest, fighting to keep going. Silas tightened his arm around her waist, looking out toward the harsh, beautiful expanse of the frontier. He found he didn't give a damn. When Clara finally opened her eyes, the first thing she saw wasn't a ceiling, but the cold steel barrel of a loaded Winchester, propped against the nightstand. The rifle was positioned with deliberate care, its stock resting on the floorboards, the hammer uncocked but ready. It wasn't left there by accident. It was a promise of violence, waiting inches from her fingertips. Clara tried to shift her weight, and the world immediately fractured into sharp, jagged shards of agony. A ragged gasp tore through her throat as fire bloomed along her right side. Her ribs felt as though they had been wrapped in barbed wire and pulled tight. She squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the nausea to pass, her fingers gripping the rough wool blanket covering her. When she forced her eyes open again, she took stock of her surroundings with the desperate, calculated focus of a cornered animal. She was in a cabin, but it didn't look like any ranch house she'd ever seen. The walls were thick, unhewn logs, stripped of bark and chinked with heavy clay. The windows were narrow, too narrow for a grown man to climb through, but perfectly sized for a rifle barrel. The furnishings were brutally Spartan: a cast-iron stove, a heavy oak table, and the narrow cot she was currently bleeding on. It wasn't a home. It was a bunker. The heavy wooden door creaked open, letting in a slice of pale morning light and the bitter chill of the high desert. Silas ducked his head to clear the doorframe. He had stripped off his duster, wearing only a faded denim shirt and canvas trousers held up by leather suspenders. His sleeves were rolled up past his elbows, revealing forearms corded with muscle and crisscrossed with faded silver scars. He carried a tin basin of steaming water and a clean rag. He didn't offer a gentle smile or a barrage of comforting words. He simply kicked the door shut with his boot, walked over to the cot, and set the basin on the nightstand beside the Winchester. "You're awake," he stated. It wasn't a question. His voice was a low, gravelly rumble that seemed to vibrate in the small room. "Where am I?" Clara croaked. Her throat felt like it was coated in lye. "Safe, for now." Silas reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a small, dark glass vial. He uncorked it with his teeth and poured a few drops of bitter-smelling liquid into a tin cup of water. "Drink. It's willow bark and laudanum. It'll take the edge off the fire in your chest." Clara stared at the cup, then up at his guarded slate-gray eyes. "I don't take medicine from strangers, not until I know why they're offering it." Silas held the cup steady. He didn't look annoyed. If anything, a faint glimmer of approval flashed in his eyes. "Fair enough. Name is Silas Thorne. We're at the ass end of Echo Canyon, 10 miles into the high rock where Decker's men don't like to ride. I stepped in yesterday because a dozen men watching a woman get kicked to death didn't sit right with my digestion." He nudged the cup closer to her unbusted lip. "Now, drink, or I'll leave it on the table and you can stare at it until you pass out from the pain." Clara measured him for a long moment. He didn't have the slick, predatory look of Decker's men. He just looked tired and dangerously capable. She took the cup with a trembling hand and swallowed the bitter draught. "I need to bind your ribs," Silas said, taking the cup back. "3 of them are cracked, maybe broken. If you move wrong, a bone splinter is going to puncture your lung and you'll drown in your own blood. I'm going to have to pull the bandages tight. It's going to hurt like hell." "Do it," she rasped, gripping the iron frame of the cot. He did. Silas was ruthlessly efficient. He didn't linger or let his hands wander. He wrapped the thick linen strips around her torso, pulling them taut with a sharp, practiced motion. Clara bit down on her lower lip so hard she tasted fresh copper. Sweat beaded on her forehead, her knuckles turning white as snow, but she refused to scream. She wouldn't give him, or the memory of Miller's boots, the satisfaction of breaking her. When Silas finished tying off the knot, he stepped back, wiping his hands on a towel. "You've got iron in your spine, Mrs. Vance. I'll give you that." "It's Clara," she breathed out, her chest feeling encased in a vice, though the sharpest stabbing pain had dulled to a heavy ache. "And I don't need flattery. I need my boots." Silas arched an eyebrow. "Your boots are covered in blood, and your body is held together by spit and linen. You aren't going anywhere. I have a freight station to run. I have to go back. You go back to Red Creek today. Decker will have you in a pine box before sundown." Silas picked up the empty basin. "Rest. The laudanum will pull you under soon." He turned and walked out of the cabin, leaving her alone with the ticking of a tin clock and the chilling reality of his words. But Clara hadn't survived a harsh frontier life by taking orders from men, no matter how capable they were with a peacemaker. She waited until she heard the rhythmic, heavy thud of an axe splitting wood somewhere out in the yard. The laudanum was starting to drag at her mind, making her limbs feel heavy, but the stubborn, desperate need to understand her cage pushed her upright. Every inch of movement was a battle. She swung her legs over the side of the cot, gasping as her ribs pulled against the tight bandages. She found her boots sitting near the stove, wiped clean of blood. Pulling them on took 5 agonizing minutes. Using the wall for support, Clara hobbled toward the heavy oak door. She pushed it open, wincing at the bright sunlight. The ranch sat at the bottom of a steep, horseshoe-shaped canyon. The rock walls rose vertically on 3 sides, 100 feet of sheer, unscalable red stone. There was only one narrow trail leading in. Silas hadn't built a ranch. He had built a choke point, a fortress. She scanned the yard. Silas was by the woodpile, his broad back to her as he swung a heavy splitting maul with rhythmic, terrifying power. Ignoring him, Clara limped toward the only other structure on the property, a low, sturdy barn built flush against the canyon wall. She needed to see if her mare had been brought along. She needed to know her escape route. The inside of the barn was cool and smelled of dry hay, neat's foot oil, and leather. 2 horses stood in their stalls, Silas's massive roan and a sturdy pack mule. Her mare was missing. Decker's men must have taken it. Frustration bubbling in her chest, Clara leaned heavily against a stack of wooden crates in the corner, trying to catch her breath. Her hand slipped, knocking the loose lid off the top crate. She looked down, expecting to see horseshoes, grain, or perhaps winter blankets. Instead, her breath hitched. Hobbling deeper into the barn's shadows, Clara didn't find extra hay. Packed meticulously in sawdust were 24 waxed red sticks of mining dynamite, complete with blasting caps and coils of fuse wire. And tucked neatly beside the explosives was a thick leather folio. The leather tie had come undone. Clara reached down with a shaking hand and pulled out the top sheet of heavy parchment. It was a bounty warrant, stamped in the corner with a glaring official seal. The Pinkerton National Detective Agency. The bounty was for a train robber, marked dead or alive, with a heavy slash of red ink crossing out the man's face. Clara stared at the blood-red ink, a cold shiver racing down her spine that had nothing to do with the desert wind. The man who had saved her wasn't a simple rancher. He was a professional killer, and she was locked in a canyon with him. The warning arrived before dawn. A slaughtered calf strung up on the barbed wire gate at the mouth of the canyon, its blood freezing into dark, jagged icicles in the morning frost. Clara watched from the cabin window, her breath fogging the glass as Silas rode back into the yard. He didn't look shaken. He simply dismounted, his hands stained crimson to the wrists from cutting the carcass down, and strode straight into the cabin. He tossed a heavy, iron-framed Colt Army revolver onto the oak table. It landed with a definitive thud. "Decker's hounds are sniffing the perimeter," Silas said, wiping his bloody hands on a rag. His gray eyes met hers, stripping away any illusion of safety. "They won't ride into the Narrows yet. They want us spooked. But when they do come, I can't be looking over my shoulder to check if you're breathing. You need to know how to kill a man." Clara stared at the heavy weapon. Her ribs throbbed in time with her pulse, a dull, agonizing ache that the willow bark tea barely touched. "I know how to shoot a rabbit, Silas." "A rabbit doesn't shoot back," he replied coldly. He walked over, picked up the Colt, and held it out by the barrel. "Take it." She reached out. The gun was shockingly heavy, its blued steel cold against her palms. They spent the afternoon behind the barn. Silas lined up empty tin cans on a jagged ridge of limestone. He didn't coddle her. He stood close behind her, adjusting her stance, his chest a hair's breadth from her back. The heat of him seeped through her cotton blouse, a stark contrast to the freezing desert wind. "Don't lock your elbows," his rough voice rumbled right next to her ear. His calloused hands covered hers, calluses scraping against her knuckles as he corrected her grip. "Squeeze the trigger. Don't pull it." Clara took a breath. aimed at the center tin, and fired. The roar of the .45 caliber round echoed off the canyon walls like a thunderclap. The heavy recoil kicked the gun upward, sending a violent shockwave straight down her arms and into her chest. Fire exploded in her fractured ribs. Clara dropped to one knee, a ragged, breathless scream trapped behind her teeth. She dropped the gun in the dirt, clutching her side as the world spun into a dizzying blur of pain. Silas didn't rush to help her up. He stood there, an immovable shadow blocking the sun. "Pick it up," he said softly. "I can't," she gasped, tears of pure agony pricking her eyes. "If Miller comes through that door, I can't, means you die on your knees," Silas said, his voice devoid of pity but thick with an undeniable, brutal truth. "Pick it up, Clara, or everything you took in that freight yard was for nothing." Clara squeezed her eyes shut. She thought of the dust. She thought of the silence of the town. With a feral, trembling breath, she reached into the dirt, wrapped her fingers around the grip of the Colt, and forced herself to stand. She raised the gun. She didn't flinch. She squeezed the trigger. The tin can danced into the air, a clean hole punched through its center. Silas let out a slow, quiet breath beside her, a silent mark of deep respect. By nightfall, Clara was exhausted, her right side a mass of bruised, screaming muscle. She was sitting at the table, wrapped in Silas's oversized duster, when the horses in the barn let out a sudden, frantic whinny. Silas was out of his chair in a heartbeat. He snatched the Winchester, kicked the chair back, and blew out the hurricane lamp, plunging the cabin into pitch blackness. "Stay low," he hissed. Footsteps crunched on the gravel outside, slow, deliberate. Then a young, trembling voice called out into the dark, "Thorne, don't shoot! My hands are empty!" Silas cracked the heavy door open, keeping the rifle leveled. Clara peered from behind the stove. Standing in the moonlight with his hands raised high in the air was a young man. He couldn't have been more than 20, wearing the dust-caked duster of Decker's payroll. "Step into the light. Slow," Silas commanded. The boy edged forward. It was Wyatt Boone, one of the hired guns who had stood by the freight office yesterday. He looked hollowed out, terrified, and utterly exhausted. He unbuckled his gun belt with 2 fingers and let it drop to the dirt. "I deserted," Wyatt said, his voice cracking. He looked past the rifle barrel, his eyes finding Clara in the dim light. "I couldn't stomach it no more, Mrs. Vance. What Miller did to you, what Decker's planning to do, I'm done." Silas didn't lower the rifle. "Why ride here? Why not just run?" "Because Decker ain't going to stop," Wyatt pleaded, stepping into the cabin. "It ain't about your freight station, Mrs. Vance. He don't care about the land, he wants the ledger. He's bringing a dozen men at first light to burn this canyon to bedrock until he finds it." Clara's blood ran cold. The ledger. "My husband's accounting book?" she asked, her voice tight. "Miller asked for it before he hit me. I told him I didn't have it." "You do," Silas said quietly, shutting and barring the door. He struck a match, relighting the hurricane lamp. His sharp eyes cut to Clara. "Or you know where it is." Clara hesitated. She looked at Wyatt, then at Silas, the ex-Pinkerton who had risked everything for her. Slowly, she reached down to the hem of her heavy wool skirt. With a sharp tug, she ripped the thick, hidden seam she had sewn shut 3 days ago. A small, black leather-bound book fell onto the floorboards. She picked it up and set it on the table. "Thomas told me to guard this with my life before he died of the fever. Said it was the only thing keeping the freight company afloat. Just cargo manifests and grain weights." Silas pulled out a chair and sat down, dragging the lamp closer. He flipped the book open. The pages were filled with neat, meticulous rows of numbers, dates, and strange abbreviations. Clara stood at his shoulder, wincing as she leaned in. "See? Grain. Feed. Iron. I spent 5 years hunting men who hid their sins in ink," Silas murmured, his calloused finger tracing a line of script. He looked up at her, the flickering lamplight casting harsh shadows across his scarred face. "This isn't grain, Clara. It's a substitution cipher." For the next hour, Silas and Clara worked in tandem. Wyatt sat in the corner, keeping watch by the window. The forced proximity of the small table meant Silas's shoulder constantly brushed against Clara's. She could smell the gunpowder, leather, and sweat on him. It was a potent, grounding scent. "Look here," Silas pointed with the tip of a hunting knife. "He marks barley arriving by train, but the weight is listed in ounces, not pounds. You don't weigh barley in ounces." Clara's breath hitched. She grabbed a charcoal pencil, her mind racing as she followed Silas's logic. She knew her husband's handwriting, knew his habits. Together they cracked the code, substituting the fake cargo manifests for the real routes. As the deciphered words began to form on the scratch paper, the cabin grew suffocatingly quiet. Gold bullion, unmarked territory routes, bribes to territorial judges. Clara stepped back from the table, her hand flying to her mouth. The numbers finally aligned, dropping like a lead weight in her stomach. Her late husband, Thomas, wasn't a hard-working martyr who had died leaving her drowning in debt. He was Decker's chief gold smuggler. And looking at the final column of deciphered numbers, the ultimate betrayal stared back at her in stark, undeniable charcoal. Thomas hadn't just smuggled the gold. He had skimmed a fortune right off the top. The betrayal of a dead man stung far worse than the boots of a living one. Clara stood up so fast the wooden chair clattered backward against the floorboards. The sudden movement sent a vicious, tearing pain through her bandaged ribs, but she barely felt it over the roaring in her ears. She stared at the ledger, at the charcoal scratch paper detailing Thomas's hidden fortune. All those nights she had stayed up late, mending flour sacks until her fingers bled, believing they were just one bad season away from losing the freight station. All the while, her husband had been sitting on a mountain of Decker's blood money. She had taken a beating in the dirt for a man who had built their entire marriage on a lie. Clara couldn't breathe. The cabin walls felt like they were shrinking, pressing the suffocating truth into her lungs. She turned and bolted for the door, throwing the heavy iron latch and stumbling out onto the porch. The high desert air was freezing, biting through her cotton blouse, but Clara welcomed the shock of it. She grabbed the rough-hewn porch rail, her knuckles turning white, and bent over. A dry, racking heave tore through her chest. She gasped for air, her vision blurring as the sheer, humiliating weight of the betrayal crushed her. She had been a fool, a naive, loyal, stupid fool. The cabin door creaked open behind her. Heavy boots stepped onto the porch. Clara stiffened, swiping fiercely at her eyes. She wouldn't cry. She had shed enough tears over Thomas Vance to fill a dry riverbed, and he didn't deserve a single drop more. Silas didn't offer a hollow string of apologies. He didn't tell her it was going to be all right. He walked up to the rail and set a heavy glass tumbler beside her trembling hand. It was filled with 3 fingers of amber whiskey. "Drink it," Silas said. He leaned against the post next to her, staring out into the pitch-black canyon. "It won't wash the taste of a lie out of your mouth, but it burns enough to make you forget it for a minute." Clara picked up the glass. Her hand shook so violently the liquor sloshed against the rim. She threw it back in one swallow. The cheap rye blazed a trail of fire down her throat, settling like a hot coal in her stomach. She coughed, squeezing her eyes shut as the warmth slowly unknotted the tight, hysterical coil in her chest. "He let me think we were starving," Clara whispered, the words tasting like ash. "He let me beg the bank for an extension on our loan while he was skimming Decker's gold." "Men do terrible things when they think they're outsmarting the devil," Silas rumbled. He pulled a tobacco pouch from his pocket, rolling a cigarette with slow, methodical precision. "And Decker is the devil." Clara turned to look at him. In the pale moonlight, Silas's profile looked like it had been carved from the canyon rock itself. Hard, weathered, and unforgiving. "You found the warrants in the barn," Silas stated. He didn't ask. He struck a match off his boot heel, cupping the flame. The brief flare illuminated the deep, jagged scar running along his jawline. "I saw the sawdust on your boots. Are you going to shoot me for snooping, Pinkerton?" she asked, her voice hollow. Silas exhaled a plume of gray smoke into the freezing air. "I haven't carried a Pinkerton badge in 4 years. "Then what are you doing hiding at the end of a box canyon with enough dynamite to blow the territory to hell?" Silas was quiet for a long time. The wind howled through the narrows, a lonely, desolate sound. When he finally spoke, his voice was stripped of its usual iron. It was raw, bleeding a grief that Clara instantly recognized. "I was hunting a man," Silas said softly. "A train robber who liked to leave no witnesses. I tracked him across 3 states. I was obsessed. I thought the badge made me righteous." He took another drag, the cherry of his cigarette burning fiercely in the dark. "I got too close. Spooked him. He figured out who was trailing him, and he decided to send a message to get me off his back." Clara's breath caught. She saw the tension coil in Silas's broad shoulders, the way his calloused hand gripped the porch rail until the wood groaned. "I came home to a burned-out farmhouse," Silas finished, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. "My wife, my 4-year-old girl, they were the message." The silence that followed was heavier than a collapsed mine shaft. Clara stared at him, the anger over her husband's betrayal suddenly feeling small and insignificant next to the yawning abyss of Silas's tragedy. "Did you find him?" she asked gently. "I found him." Silas turned his head, his slate-gray eyes meeting hers. There was no triumph in them, only the dead, cold ash of a fire that had consumed everything. "I put 3 bullets in his chest and watched him die in the mud. But it didn't bring them back. It didn't wash the soot off my hands. So I threw the badge in the river, bought this canyon, and swore I'd never draw a gun for another man's war again." Until yesterday, Clara realized, the truth of it piercing her heart. "He broke his vow for me." "Until yesterday," Silas agreed softly. He looked at her, really looked at her. He saw the bruises blooming purple and black across her cheek, the fierce, unyielding set of her jaw, the way she stood tall despite the broken bones in her chest. 2 fractured souls, standing in the wreckage of their pasts, recognizing the exact same shape of survival in each other. Silas reached out. His large, rough hand gently brushed a stray lock of hair away from her battered face. The touch was so tender, so completely at odds with the violence she knew he was capable of, that Clara let out a shaky breath. She didn't pull away. The freezing wind whipped around them, but the space between their bodies was suddenly suffocatingly hot. Clara looked up at his mouth, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her fractured ribs. She didn't want to think about Thomas. She didn't want to think about Decker, or the gold, or the ledger. She just wanted to feel something real, something that wasn't a lie. Clara reached up, her trembling fingers gripping the rough canvas of Silas's shirt, and pulled him down. Silas didn't hesitate. He closed the distance, his mouth crashing down on hers. It wasn't a gentle, romantic kiss. It was desperate and feral, tasting of cheap whiskey, tobacco, and the salt of unshed tears. Silas's large hands framed her face, his thumbs brushing her jawline as he kissed her like a man who had been starving in the desert and had just found water. Clara leaned into him, letting the solid, unyielding heat of his chest anchor her to the earth. A soft moan vibrated in her throat, the pain in her ribs entirely forgotten in the blinding, consuming rush of his touch. He tasted of survival. He tasted like the first honest thing she'd known in years. Silas's arm slid down to her waist, pulling her flush against him. Clara's hands tangled in his thick, dark hair. They were drowning in each other, trying to burn away the ghosts that haunted them both. They didn't have time to pull away. The scent registered first, a harsh, acrid smell that cut right through the cold night air and the haze of their desire. It smelled like sulfur, like pine pitch, like smoke. Silas broke the kiss abruptly, his head snapping up. His gray eyes widened, the softness vanishing, replaced instantly by the lethal focus of a hunter. Clara turned, following his gaze. The horizon at the mouth of the canyon was no longer black. It was burning a violent, unnatural orange. Plumes of thick black smoke were rolling over the limestone ridges, carried directly toward the ranch on the driving desert wind. "Wyatt!" Silas roared, kicking the cabin door open. "Get the rifles!" Decker's men weren't attacking the house directly. They knew about the choke point. They were burning the valley to smoke them out. The canyon walls glowed like the mouth of hell, and the bullets snapping through the air sounded like the devil's own whistle. Thick, oily plumes of black smoke rolled down the limestone corridor, driven by the relentless high desert wind. Decker's men had set the dry brush at the canyon's mouth ablaze, using the inferno as a suffocating screen to advance into the narrows. Inside the cabin, chaos erupted with disciplined, terrifying speed. Silas kicked the heavy oak table onto its side, dragging it across the floorboards to barricade the front window. "Wyatt, take the loft in the barn. You've got the high ground. Don't waste lead on shadows. Wait until they clear the smoke." "Yes, sir." Wyatt grabbed a Henry repeating rifle and a bandolier of cartridges, his face pale beneath a layer of fresh soot. He bolted out the back door, sprinting for the barn just as the first volley of gunfire chewed into the cabin's log exterior. Silas shoved the heavy Colt Army revolver into Clara's hands. "Stay behind the stove. If anything comes through that door that isn't me, you empty the cylinder." Before Clara could answer, Silas shattered the remaining glass in the window with the butt of his Winchester, resting the barrel on the overturned table. He didn't flinch as wood splinters rained down around him. He simply exhaled, narrowed his slate-gray eyes against the stinging smoke, and went to work. The firefight was deafening. It wasn't the clean, rhythmic popping of a target range. It was a chaotic, overlapping roar of destruction. Lever-action rifles cracked. Heavy revolvers boomed. Bullets thudded into the thick clay and timber of the cabin with sick, heavy thumps, kicking up clouds of dust inside the small room. Silas was a machine. He fired, worked the lever with a blur of motion, and fired again. Every time his Winchester barked, a scream echoed from the smoke outside. He was methodical, deadly, and entirely devoid of fear. "Three down the center!" Wyatt yelled from the barn loft, his rifle cracking in rapid succession. "They're trying to flank the water trough." "Hold them off!" Silas roared back over the din. He ducked as a heavy .50 caliber Sharps round tore right through the window frame, missing his head by inches and burying itself deep in the far wall. Clara crouched behind the cast-iron stove, her hands trembling so violently the Colt rattled against her knees. The heat pushing into the canyon was becoming oppressive, baking the air inside the cabin. Sweat stung her eyes. Every erratic breath she took to feed her racing heart felt like a jagged knife twisting between her ribs. She wasn't a soldier. She was a freight manager. But as the barrage of lead continued, tearing her sanctuary to pieces, the terror morphing in her chest crystallized into something else. Rage. She crawled toward the edge of the barricade, her boots slipping on spent brass casings. She peered around the edge of the iron stove. Outside, the yard was a nightmare of orange flame and choking gray fog. Silas was pinned down, focused entirely on two men laying down heavy suppressing fire from a ridge of boulders straight ahead. Because of the noise, Silas didn't hear the crunch of gravel to his immediate right. But Clara saw the shadow. A massive figure emerged from the smoke, creeping along the blind side of the cabin wall. It was one of Decker's hired killers, his face covered by a soot-stained bandana. In his right hand, he didn't hold a gun. He held a serrated Bowie knife, its long blade catching the hellish glow of the fire. He was less than 10 feet from the window, lunging toward Silas's exposed flank. "Silas!" Clara screamed, but her voice was entirely swallowed by a fresh volley of rifle fire. The thug vaulted up onto the edge of the porch, raising the blade to plunge it down into Silas's neck. Clara didn't think. She didn't have time to hesitate. She threw herself out from behind the stove, raising the heavy Colt with both hands. She remembered the heat of Silas's chest against her back. She remembered his voice. "Squeeze the trigger, don't pull it." She squeezed. The Colt roared, kicking upward with violent, bone-jarring force. The recoil tore through her fractured ribs like a hot poker, stealing the air right out of her lungs. Through the smoke, the heavy .45 slug caught the thug dead center in his chest. His momentum stopped instantly, as if he'd run into an invisible brick wall. The Bowie knife slipped from his fingers, clattering onto the porch boards, and his eyes widened in shock before he collapsed backward into the dirt. Clara dropped the revolver. Her hands flew to her mouth, her eyes locked on the lifeless body bleeding out just beyond the windowsill. She had just killed a man. She had taken a human life. A violent wave of nausea hit her. She pitched forward onto her hands and knees, dry heaving onto the dusty floorboards, her body shaking uncontrollably. The physical agony in her chest warred with the psychological horror of what she had just done. Suddenly, strong, rough hands grabbed her shoulders. Silas hauled her back behind the solid iron of the stove just as a hail of bullets chewed up the floorboards where she had been kneeling. He gripped her face, his calloused thumbs smearing the soot mixed with her tears. His gray eyes were intense, burning with a fierce protective fire. "Look at me," Silas commanded, his voice cutting cleanly through the ringing in her ears. "Look at me, Clara," she gasped, her chest heaving, staring wildly up at him. "You didn't just kill a man," Silas shouted over the gunfire, pressing his forehead against hers. "You stopped being a victim. You just reclaimed your right to live. Do you hear me? Breathe!" Clara sucked in a ragged, painful breath, the panic receding, leaving behind a cold, hard clarity. She nodded once. Silas gave her jaw a firm squeeze, then spun back to the window, racking a fresh shell into his rifle. "We're running dry," Wyatt shouted from the barn. He scrambled down from the loft, keeping his head low as he sprinted across the gap and dove through the cabin's back door. He hit the floor hard, coughing up black smoke. "I'm out of rifle rounds. The fire is jumping the corral. If we stay here, we roast." Silas looked up. The roof of the porch had caught fire from falling embers. The heat was blistering, and the smoke inside the cabin was growing thick enough to choke a horse. Decker's men were advancing again, using the growing inferno as a shield. They were trapped. Silas wiped a mixture of sweat and blood from his brow, his jaw setting into a granite line. He looked at the encroaching flames, then turned his gaze toward the barn where the wooden crates sat waiting in the sawdust. With their cover burning to ash, Silas stared at the crates of dynamite. "We don't wait for them to breach," he grunted, reaching into his pocket and pulling out a box of matches. "We bring the mountain down on them." The explosion deafened the world, burying Decker's men under tons of rock and sealing the canyon tight. It wasn't just a sound. It was a physical force that punched the air from Clara's lungs. Silas had hurled the bundled sticks of dynamite into the narrowest, most unstable choke point of the limestone gorge, shooting the fuse mid-air with his Winchester before diving back through the cabin door. The shockwave hit a second later. The log walls of the cabin groaned, shedding decades of dust and clay chinking. Outside, the sheer cliff faces collapsed with a catastrophic roar, sending a massive avalanche of red boulders, dirt, and splintered pine crashing down into the bottleneck. The landslide smothered the brush fire instantly, burying the flames and anyone foolish enough to be standing in the narrows under 50 feet of jagged stone. Then, an eerie, ringing silence descended over Echo Canyon. Inside the cabin, the air was thick with pulverized rock and the sharp sulfuric stench of explosives. Clara coughed violently, curling into a tight ball on the floorboards as the pain in her ribs flared into a blinding crescendo. "Everyone whole?" Silas's voice was a rough, coughing rasp from the darkness. Wyatt groaned from the corner near the stove, brushing a layer of debris off his shoulders. "I'm breathing. Think my ears are bleeding, but I'm breathing." Silas struck a match with a sharp scritch, lighting a single soot-stained hurricane lamp. The dim yellow glow revealed the absolute wreck of the cabin, but it also revealed Silas. He was leaning heavily against the overturned table, his face pale beneath a mask of dirt and sweat. His right hand was clamped over his left shoulder. Thick, dark blood was seeping through his fingers, running down his forearm and dripping steadily onto the floorboards. "Silas!" Clara scrambled to her knees, ignoring the agonizing protest of her chest. "Ricochet," he grunted, his jaw tight as he pushed himself upright. "Caught a splinter of lead and rock when the cliff face blew." He looked at Wyatt, his eyes still hard and authoritative despite the blood loss. "Boone, check the back wall. See if the structural timber's held. Then check the horses in the deep cave behind the barn. Give us 10 minutes. Wyatt took one look at the blood pooling at Silas's boots, nodded quickly, and slipped out the back door into the settling dust. Silas swayed slightly. Clara was there in a heartbeat, her small frame pressing under his good arm to bear his weight. "Sit down," she ordered, her voice trembling but fierce. "Before you fall down." She guided him to the edge of the narrow cot. Silas sank down heavily, his breath hitching as he finally let go of his shoulder. The heavy canvas duster and denim shirt were torn, the fabric slick with blood. Clara didn't hesitate. The terror of the gunfight was gone, replaced by a cold, primal need to keep this man alive. She fetched the basin of water, now coated with a thin film of dust, a clean rag, and the half-empty bottle of rye whiskey from the shelf. "Take the shirt off," Clara instructed, pulling a small, sharp paring knife from the table. Silas managed a grim, tight-lipped smile. "Yes, ma'am." With agonizing slowness, he peeled the ruined shirt off his back. Clara's breath caught in her throat. Silas's torso was a map of old violence. Pale silver scars crisscrossed his ribs and back, souvenirs from a lifetime of hunting desperate men. But the new wound was an ugly, jagged tear high on his left deltoid, welling with fresh, dark blood. "The slug didn't hit the bone," Silas rasped, his eyes fixed on the far wall. "But there's debris in there. You're going to have to dig it out." Clara poured a liberal splash of the cheap rye directly over the open wound. Silas's entire body went rigid as stone. The muscles in his back corded, his hands gripping the iron frame of the cot until his knuckles turned white, but he didn't make a sound. "I'm sorry," Clara whispered, her hands shaking as she sterilized the tip of the knife with the whiskey. "Don't be sorry, be fast," he grunted. She pressed her knee against the side of the cot to steady herself, ignoring the sharp stab in her own bandaged ribs. She leaned in close. The smell of him, sweat, gun oil, blood, and the raw musk of survival filled her senses. She pinched the edges of the wound, probing carefully with the tip of the blade. "Got it," she breathed. With a quick, precise flick of her wrist, she dug out a twisted, bloody fragment of lead and stone. It clattered into the tin basin. Silas let out a long, shuddering exhale, his head dropping forward. Clara quickly folded the clean rag, soaking it in the remaining whiskey, and pressed it hard against the wound to staunch the bleeding. She grabbed a roll of clean linen and began to wrap his shoulder. To get the leverage needed, she had to step directly between his spread knees, leaning her torso over his chest to pass the bandage behind his back. The forced proximity stripped away the last of the air in the room. Her hands brushed the hot, sweat-dampened skin of his back. She could feel the heavy, erratic thud of his heart against her collarbone. The adrenaline of the shootout was crashing, leaving behind a raw, terrifying vulnerability. Clara tied off the bandage. She didn't step back. She couldn't. Her hands lingered on his bare shoulders, her fingers tracing the edge of an old, faded scar. Silas lifted his head. His face was mere inches from hers. The slate gray of his eyes had darkened to the color of a storm-tossed sea. He looked at her battered face, the soot smudged across her cheek, the fierce, beautiful defiance that had kept her alive when she should have broken. "You're shaking," he murmured, his voice a low rumble that vibrated against her chest. "I'm alive," Clara whispered back, a tear finally escaping and cutting a clean path down her dusty cheek. "Because of you." Silas brought his right hand up, his rough, calloused thumb catching the tear before it reached her jaw. "No. You're alive because you refused to die. I just gave you the gun." He didn't ask for permission, and she didn't want him to. Clara leaned forward, closing the final inch between them, pressing her mouth to his. The kiss was an explosion of a different kind. It was desperate, bruising, and completely uninhibited. The barriers they had built to survive their pasts crumbled to ash. Silas's good arm wrapped around her waist, pulling her down onto his lap. Clara gasped softly against his lips, mindful of her ribs, but refusing to pull away. She anchored her hands in his thick hair, drinking him in, needing the solid, undeniable proof that they had survived. There was no gentleness in the dark of that cabin, only the raw, consuming fire of two people claiming each other at the end of the world. Silas carried her the rest of the way down to the narrow cot. He was careful of her battered ribs, bearing his own weight, but his touch was possessive, urgent. In the shadows, surrounded by the smell of gunpowder and whiskey, they found a blinding, searing solace in each other's flesh. It was a fierce, silent communion, a vow made without words, written in sweat and hitched breaths, sealing them together against the harshness of the frontier. Dawn broke cold and gray, filtering through the shattered window in pale, dusty shafts of light. Clara was asleep, her head resting on Silas's uninjured chest, her breathing finally deep and even. Silas lay awake, staring at the ceiling timbers. His shoulder throbbed with a dull, heavy ache, but the weight in his chest, the crushing guilt he had carried for 4 years, felt lighter. Careful not to wake her, Silas slipped out from under the heavy wool blanket. He pulled on his stiff, blood-stained denim shirt, wincing as the fabric dragged across his fresh bandages. He walked quietly toward the stove to start a fire, the morning chill biting at his skin. He reached for his boots. Silas froze. The match in his hand snapped in two. A cold draft was sweeping across the floorboards. The heavy oak door at the back of the cabin, the one leading to the barn and the canyon's hidden exit trails, was ajar. Silas's gaze snapped to the corner of the room where Wyatt had left his gear. The saddlebags were missing. He pivoted, his eyes locking onto the center of the wooden table. The space where they had left the deciphered papers and the black leather book was completely empty. Dawn broke cold and gray. Silas reached for his boots only to find the door ajar. Wyatt Boone was gone, and so was the ledger. Clara wiped a smear of dried blood from the receiver of her Winchester rifle with a frayed rag. She was done running. Today she became the hunter. She sat on the edge of the narrow cot, the bitter morning cold seeping through the gaps in the cabin's shattered window. Her ribs screamed a dull, rhythmic protest with every breath she took. But the pain was a grounding anchor. It reminded her she was still breathing. Silas stood by the open back door, his broad silhouette framed by the pale gray dawn. He was staring at the ground, reading the dirt with the practiced, calculating eye of a man who hunted for a living. His freshly bandaged left shoulder hung stiffly, his arm braced against his belt to keep the torn muscle from pulling. "He didn't go back to Decker," Silas rasped, his voice rough with sleep and pain. He kicked a loose stone with the toe of his boot. The tracks from the corral head straight up the goat trail, north, over the ridge. Clara stopped polishing the rifle. She set the rag down, her brow furrowing. "North? There's nothing north of here but sheer rock and the Blackwood railhead." Silas turned, his slate-gray eyes meeting hers. "There's a telegraph office at Blackwood. That kid saw the ledger. He saw the bodies piling up. He's not running away, Clara. He's trying to send a wire to the U.S. Marshals in the capital to clear his conscience." For a fleeting second, relief washed over Clara. Wyatt hadn't betrayed them. But the relief evaporated the moment she saw the grim, hard set of Silas's jaw. "The Marshals are 3 days' hard ride from here," Silas said, stepping back into the cabin and pulling the door shut against the wind. "And that's assuming the wire even goes through. Decker owns the Blackwood operator. He owns the lines. The second Wyatt steps into that office and starts tapping out Decker's name, he's a dead man." Clara stood up, wincing as her stiff muscles stretched. If Decker intercepts that wire, he'll know the ledger is out there. He'll know we aren't buried under the rock slide. He already suspects it, Silas corrected, walking over to the stove and grabbing his gun belt. He buckled it with one hand, his movements tight and economical. Decker's a snake, but he ain't stupid. He knows the Pinkertons won't stop if a federal warrant is officially requested. He won't wait to fight a war with the U.S. government. Clara looked at the empty table where the deciphered ledger had been. She knew the train schedules of Red Creek by heart. She knew the weight limits, the cargo manifests, and the departure times. It was her blood and sweat that had built that knowledge. "The 6 a.m. outbound freight," Clara said, her voice dropping to a hollow whisper as the realization hit her. "It's a direct line across the territory border." "If Decker wants to cut his losses, he'll load the gold onto that train right now and vanish before the sun even clears the mountains." Silas nodded slowly. "He'll take his heaviest hitters, pack the bullion in unmarked crates, and leave the town to burn behind him." "No." The word cracked like a whip in the small room. Clara gripped the barrel of the Winchester. Her knuckles were bruised, her face swollen, and her body held together by tight linen and stubborn rage. But her eyes were clear, burning with a terrifying, absolute resolve. "He doesn't get to walk away," Clara said, her voice trembling not from fear, but from raw, unadulterated fury. "He doesn't get to beat me in the street, use my husband as a smuggler, and ride off into the sunrise with a fortune while this town chokes on his dust." Silas watched her for a long moment. He saw the fire in her, the same fire that had pulled him out of his 4-year purgatory. He knew exactly what she was asking. "The goat trail is treacherous," Silas warned softly. "It's steep, narrow, and iced over in the shadows. And when we get to the depot, it won't be a gunfight, Clara. It'll be a slaughter. Decker will have a dozen men guarding that gold. It's a suicide mission." Clara stepped up to him, closing the distance between them. The memory of their desperate, fierce intimacy from the night before hung heavy in the air, a silent tether binding them together. She reached out, her hand resting gently over his heart, right above the leather of his suspenders. "I died in the dirt 2 days ago, Silas," she whispered, looking up into his weathered face. "Everything after that is borrowed time. I'm not spending it hiding in a cave." Silas let out a heavy, resigned exhale. The corner of his mouth twitched upward in a grim, proud smile. He lifted his right hand, his rough thumb brushing across the fading bruise on her cheekbone. "All right, then," he murmured. "We go hunting." And they moved with ruthless efficiency. Silas saddled his massive roan gelding and a sturdy dun mare that Wyatt had left behind. Clara packed her duster pockets with extra boxes of 4440 cartridges. She strapped a leather cartridge belt over her shoulder, the brass glinting in the dim light. The ride up the goat trail was agonizing. The narrow path hugged the sheer cliff face, the drop-off plummeting hundreds of feet into the darkness below. The freezing wind whipped at their faces, biting through their coats. With every lurch of the dun mare, Clara's ribs ground together in a sickening symphony of pain. But she clamped her jaw shut and kept her eyes locked on Silas's broad back riding ahead of her. It took them an hour to crest the ridge and navigate the back trails down toward the valley floor. When they finally broke through the tree line, the town of Red Creek lay below them, shrouded in a thick, soupy morning fog. Down at the freight depot, Clara's depot, the massive black iron boiler of the 6 a.m. outbound locomotive hissed and spat steam into the freezing air. The sharp metallic clatter of heavy wooden crates being loaded into the reinforced boxcars echoed up the hillside. Lanterns swung in the mist, casting long, monstrous shadows of armed men patrolling the loading dock. They had made it in time. But Silas had been right. It was a fortress of hired guns. Silas dismounted silently, tying the roan to a scrub oak. He pulled his Winchester from its saddle scabbard and checked the action. Clara slid down from her mare, biting back a groan as her boots hit the frozen earth. She stepped up beside him, staring down at the train yard. The air smelled of pine needles, coal smoke, and impending violence. Silas reached down to his hip. He checked the cylinder of his heavy Colt peacemaker, ensuring every chamber was loaded, before snapping it shut with a final metallic click. He turned his head, his slate-gray eyes locking onto Clara's with a deadly calm certainty. "Ready to take back your town?" he asked. The Red Creek Freight Depot was choked with morning fog and engine steam, turning the train cars into steel ghosts. The massive iron boiler of the locomotive hissed and spat, a mechanical beast eager to be unchained. The damp, freezing air trapped the thick coal smoke against the ground, mixing it with the dense valley fog to create a blinding gray soup. It was the perfect cover for a massacre. Clara moved through the shadows of the water tower, a canvas satchel slung across her chest. Inside rested 4 sticks of Silas's dynamite, wired tight with blasting caps and a short, fast-burning fuse. Every step sent a jolt of fire through her bound ribs, but her mind was entirely detached from the pain. She stared at the loading dock, the exact spot where Miller had kicked her into the dirt just days ago. Not today, she promised herself. Silas crouched beside her behind a stack of rotting railroad ties. His face was a hard, pale mask in the mist, his breath pluming in the cold air. He checked the action of his Winchester one last time, ignoring the dark blood that had already begun to seep through the fresh bandages on his left shoulder. "Decker's men are clustered around the last 2 boxcars," Silas whispered, his voice barely audible over the hiss of the train. "That's where the gold is. The engineer's in the cab waiting for the signal to pull out." "I need to get to the tracks just ahead of the cowcatcher," Clara said, her fingers gripping the strap of the satchel. "If I blow the rails at the switch, the train derails the second it tries to leave the yard." "You'll have a 50-yard open sprint to get there," Silas said grimly. He thumbed the hammer of his rifle. "I'll buy you the clearing. When I open up, you run. You don't look back, Clara. You plant that charge and you get to cover." Clara looked at him. She saw the grim finality in his slate-gray eyes. He was going to draw the fire of a dozen hired guns to give her a window. It was a suicide run, and he was taking the vanguard. She reached out, her bruised hand gripping the collar of his duster, and pulled him down for a hard, bruising kiss. It tasted of fear, soot, and absolute devotion. "Give them hell, Pinkerton," she breathed against his lips. Silas gave her a sharp, feral grin. "Count on it." He broke from cover. Silas didn't try to sneak. He walked straight out into the swirling fog of the rail yard, a lone, dark silhouette against the white steam. He raised the Winchester to his good shoulder. "Hey!" one of the guards by the boxcar shouted, squinting into the mist. "Who's out there?" Silas's answer was a .44-40 hollow point round that shattered the guard's lantern and punched straight through his chest. Chaos erupted instantly. "It's Thorne!" someone screamed. Gunfire tore through the fog, a deafening cacophony of revolvers and repeating rifles. Silas didn't stop moving. He worked the lever of his Winchester with blinding mechanical speed, firing into the flashes of muzzle flare. Wood splintered off the sides of the boxcars. Hot brass casings rained down on the gravel. Every time Silas fired, a man dropped, but there were simply too many of them. Now, Clara sprinted from the shadows. She kept low, scrambling under the heavy iron couplings of the stationary passenger cars, her boots slipping on the frosted gravel. Bullets whined and snapped through the air above her, completely focused on the one-man army tearing Decker's crew apart on the loading dock. She reached the front of the locomotive. The heat radiating from the massive iron boiler washed over her face, smelling of hot oil and burning coal. She dropped to her knees, biting back a scream as her ribs ground together. With trembling, blood-slicked fingers, Clara pulled the dynamite from the satchel. She wedged the bundled sticks tight into the iron switch-track mechanism directly in front of the train. She pulled a match from her pocket and struck it against the steel rail. Back on the dock, the firefight was turning brutal. Silas's Winchester clicked empty. He dropped it, drawing his heavy Colt peacemaker with his right hand. He was bleeding from a graze on his thigh, and his wounded left shoulder was entirely useless now, hanging limply at his side. He backed up toward the freight office, firing with deadly precision, dropping 2 more men who tried to flank him through the steam. But Decker's men were professionals. They realized he was injured. 3 men laid down a punishing barrage of suppressing fire from the roof of a boxcar, pinning Silas behind a stack of wooden crates. The wood above Silas's head exploded into a shower of splinters. He ducked, thumbing fresh cartridges into the loading gate of his Colt with his one good hand. Suddenly, the heavy blast of a shotgun roared from the blind side of the fog. The buckshot missed Silas's chest but caught him in his bad shoulder and side, shredding the heavy canvas of his duster. The sheer kinetic force of the blast lifted him off his feet. Silas hit the wooden platform hard, his revolver clattering out of his grip and sliding across the frost-slicked floorboards. He groaned, fighting to push himself up, but his left arm completely gave out. Blood pooled rapidly beneath him, soaking into the wood. The gunfire abruptly ceased, leaving only the violent hiss of the locomotive's steam engine. Heavy, expensive leather boots stepped into Silas's blurry line of vision. The fog parted. Harlan Decker stood over him, wearing a tailored wool overcoat, completely untouched by the dirt and blood of the yard. Decker looked down at the ruined, bleeding man at his feet, his upper lip curling in profound disgust. He reached inside his coat and casually drew a silver-plated derringer, cocking the hammer back with a sharp, metallic click. "End of the line, Pinkerton," Decker sneered, aiming the barrel directly between Silas's eyes. Silas hit the wooden platform hard, his blood pooling on the very boards where Clara had nearly died a month ago. He tasted copper and sawdust, his vision swimming as the buckshot burned like hot coals in his side. He tried to reach for his fallen peacemaker, but his fingers wouldn't obey. His body had finally reached its absolute limit. Harlan Decker stood over him, a pristine phantom in the swirling fog, the silver barrel of the derringer gleaming dully in the morning light. "I have to admit, Thorne, you cost me a fortune in good men," Decker said, his voice smooth, cultured, and utterly devoid of humanity. He glanced around at the bodies littering his freight yard. "But in the end, you're just another dead dog bleeding on my property. Did you really think you could stop this train?" Silas didn't beg. He didn't curse. He looked up at Decker, his slate-gray eyes cold and defiant, and spat a mouthful of blood onto the toe of Decker's polished boot. Decker's face twisted in rage. "Go to hell." His finger tightened on the trigger. 50 yards away, the dynamite fuse hissed, burning its way toward the blasting caps. But Clara didn't run for cover. She had crawled out from beneath the cowcatcher just in time to see Silas blown off his feet. She saw the blood. She saw Decker standing over him, raising the gun. Time seemed to fracture, slowing to an agonizing crawl. The trauma of her own beating rushed back, the helplessness, the suffocating silence of the town, the absolute certainty that she was going to die in the dirt while a monster watched from above. Not him. You don't get to take him. Clara stood up. She didn't feel her broken ribs. She didn't feel the freezing wind or the exhaustion pulling at her bones. She only felt the heavy, oiled walnut stock of her Winchester rifle as she raised it to her shoulder. She didn't shout Decker's name. She didn't give him the courtesy of a final monologue. Monologues were for men who played games with lives. Clara Vance was a woman protecting the only thing in the world she had left to love. The heavy clack-clack of Clara working the lever of the Winchester cut sharply through the hiss of the steam. Decker's head snapped up. He peered into the thick fog toward the front of the train, his eyes widening as the silhouette of a woman materialized from the white mist. He didn't even have time to swing his gun toward her. Clara exhaled, her sights perfectly aligned with the center of Decker's tailored wool coat, and she squeezed the trigger. The rifle roared, spitting a foot-long tongue of orange flame into the fog. The heavy .44-40 slug caught Harlan Decker perfectly in the center of his chest, shattering his breastbone and tearing through his heart. The impact lifted the mining baron entirely off his feet. His silver derringer fired harmlessly into the sky as he was thrown backward, crashing down onto the wooden platform like a discarded marionette with its strings cut. He didn't twitch. He was dead before his head hit the boards. The remaining 3 hired guards stared at their boss's lifeless body in absolute paralyzed shock. They looked up, trying to find the shooter in the fog. Before they could raise their weapons, the fuse Clara had lit reached the blasting caps. The explosion at the front of the train was catastrophic. The dynamite ripped through the iron rails and the wooden ties, sending a massive geyser of earth, steel, and smoke high into the freezing morning air. The concussive shockwave knocked the remaining guards off their feet and shattered every glass window in the freight depot. The locomotive let out a deafening, shrieking whistle of escaping pressure as its front wheels derailed, sinking into the blasted crater and permanently locking the gold shipment in place. Silence, heavy and ringing, finally fell over Red Creek. Clara dropped the Winchester. It clattered against the gravel. Her legs gave out and she stumbled forward, her boots slipping on the icy ground as she ran toward the loading dock. "Silas!" she screamed, her voice tearing from her throat. She scrambled up the wooden stairs, falling to her knees beside him. Silas was pale, his breathing shallow and ragged, his blood staining the wood beneath them. "Silas, stay with me," Clara sobbed, ripping her scarf from her neck and pressing it frantically against the terrible wounds in his side. "Look at me. You stay right here." Silas's eyelids fluttered. He turned his head slightly, his hazy gray eyes finding her face. He looked past her, seeing Decker's lifeless body sprawled in the dirt a few yards away. The monster was dead. The gold was stopped. A weak, bloody smile touched the corner of Silas's mouth. He reached up with his right hand, his trembling fingers wrapping weakly around her wrist. "Told you," Silas rasped, his voice barely a whisper against the hissing steam. "You knew how to shoot." His eyes rolled back and his hand went limp in hers. This time the silence that fell over Red Creek wasn't born of cowardice. It was the sound of a town finally exhaling. The heavy, suffocating fog began to lift, burned away by the rising sun, revealing the absolute ruin of Harlan Decker's empire. The locomotive hissed its dying breath, its front wheels buried deep in the splintered, soot-blackened crater Clara had blown through the tracks. The unmarked crates in the boxcars had split open, spilling dull, heavy gold ingots onto the frost-covered gravel. Clara didn't care about the gold. She knelt in the pooling blood on the loading dock, her hands pressing down with all her remaining strength on Silas's shredded shoulder and side. "Don't you dare!" she sobbed, her voice cracking as his blood slipped through her fingers. "Don't you dare leave me now, Silas Thorne." The 3 surviving guards had dropped their weapons, raising their hands in surrender. They had seen Decker's chest caved in by a woman with broken ribs. They had seen the Pinkerton take a shotgun blast and keep shooting. They were done. The rhythmic, thunderous drumming of approaching hooves shattered the morning quiet. Bursting through the remaining mist at the edge of town rode a dozen men on lathered horses. At the front of the pack was Wyatt Boone, his face pale and tight with exhaustion. Beside him rode men wearing long dusters, the unmistakable glint of silver U.S. Marshal stars pinned to their chests. Wyatt had made it. He had tapped the wire from the next county over, riding his horse half to death to bring the federal cavalry. The lead marshal reined in his horse, his eyes taking in the derailed train, the surrendered thugs, and the dead mining baron sprawled in the dirt. Then his gaze fell on the woman kneeling on the blood-soaked wooden platform. Clara didn't raise her hands. She kept the pressure on Silas's wounds, turning her fierce, tear-streaked face toward the lawman. Her Winchester lay right beside her knee. "I need the doctor!" Clara screamed, her voice echoing off the brick walls of the depot with terrifying authority. "Get the damn doctor out here right now, or I'll drag him out by his hair." The lead marshal didn't ask questions. He signaled 2 of his deputies. 5 minutes later, the town physician, the same man who had locked his clinic doors while Clara was beaten a month ago, was hauled onto the loading dock. He took one look at Clara's eyes, swallowed his fear, and went to work on the ruined man, bleeding out on the wood. Silas didn't die on the dock. He survived the agonizing surgery on the station manager's desk, and he survived the fever that followed. The marshals dismantled Decker's network, seizing the gold and arresting the corrupt officials he had bribed. But Clara and Silas didn't stick around to play the heroes, and they didn't wait for the town to offer their hollow apologies. They took the federal bounty money issued for Decker and his dead crew, packed their horses, and rode back into the mountains. They left the cowards of Red Creek to sweep up their own broken glass and rebuild their own mess. 1 year later, the wind howling through Echo Canyon had lost its bite, carrying the warm, sweet scent of blooming sage and fresh hay. Clara stood on the wide wraparound porch of the newly expanded log home, a steaming mug of black coffee warming her hands. She took a deep breath, the crisp morning air filling her lungs. There was no sharp, stabbing pain anymore. Her ribs had healed, though they still left her with a dull ache when the winter rains came, and she walked with a very slight limp when she was tired. She considered those aches the fair price of a life actually worth living. The canyon was no longer a grim, isolated fortress waiting for a siege. The barricades were gone. In their place stood sturdy, well-built corral fences holding a dozen prime quarter horses. Down in the training ring, Silas was working a spirited young colt. He didn't wear a gun belt anymore. He wore a faded canvas work shirt and leather chaps. He moved with a slight stiffness in his left shoulder, a permanent reminder of the buckshot he had taken on the loading dock, but his strength was undeniable. He spoke to the horse in low, calm murmurs, his large hands guiding the reins with the same gentle precision he had used to bind her wounds. Wyatt Boone walked out of the new barn, carrying a saddle over his shoulder. He tipped his hat to Clara, yelling over the corral fence to Silas about the price of feed in the next county. Wyatt hadn't left. He had used his share of the reward money to buy a stake in the ranch, trading the life of a hired gun for the calluses of an honest horse breeder. Silas handed the colt over to Wyatt, wiped the sweat from his brow with the back of his hand, and looked up toward the porch. Even from 50 yards away, Clara felt the impact of those slate-gray eyes. The cold, dead ash that used to reside in them was entirely gone. When Silas looked at her now, he looked like a man who had walked through hell and finally found his heaven. He smiled, a slow, genuine expression that transformed his rugged face, and started walking toward the house. Later that evening, the cabin was warm, illuminated by the soft, golden glow of a proper oil lamp, rather than a soot-stained hurricane lantern. Clara stood in the bedroom, washing her face at a clean porcelain basin. She reached for a towel, her gaze lifting to the polished glass mirror hanging on the log wall. She stared at her reflection. She looked older, her face weathered by the high desert sun and the hard work of building a ranch from the ground up. Her fingers drifted upward, gently tracing the faint, jagged scar that slashed across her left cheekbone, the last visible remnant of Miller's heavy boots. Heavy, familiar footsteps crossed the floorboards. Silas stepped up behind her, his broad chest pressed against her back, radiating a steady, comforting heat. He wrapped his strong arms around her waist, pulling her flush against him. He rested his chin on her shoulder, his eyes meeting hers in the mirror. He reached up, his calloused, scarred fingers gently replacing hers over her cheekbone. "You're staring at it again," Silas murmured, his low, gravelly voice sending a shiver of warmth down her spine. "It's ugly," Clara whispered softly. "It's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen," Silas corrected fiercely. He turned her around in his arms, his hands framing her face with profound reverence. "That scar just proves you survived, Clara. It proves they couldn't break you." He leaned down, pressing a soft, lingering kiss directly over the faded mark on her cheek. Clara closed her eyes, leaning her weight into him. The steady, powerful rhythm of his heartbeat thumped against her chest, perfectly matching her own. "And I'll spend the rest of my life," Silas whispered against her skin, his arms tightening around her, "making sure you don't get another scratch." Clara smiled, wrapping her arms around his neck and pulling him down for a kiss that tasted of peace, of home, and of a future they had carved out of the rock with their own 2 hands. Outside, the canyon wind settled into a gentle breeze. The dust storm of their past had finally passed, and looking out over the ridge, there was nothing left but the bright, unyielding dawn. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.